So let's go ahead and look at a little more detail at each of the arguments the Marquis offers and try to understand why he thinks that it bolsters the case for flow as the source of the right to life. So the first argument, as we noted, was this argument that he says that flow both predicts and explains why it is that people think of death as a misfortune. And so he says, look, if death was simply the cessation of experiences, then one might wonder why people consider death to be a misfortune. And the answer that occurs to people is that death would be considered a misfortune because death would be the deprivation of these future goods of consciousness. So if by dying I no longer am capable of being rational, having a sense of myself as a continuing entity, communicating complex ideas, having qualitative experiences, and so on, then death represents a misfortune for me. It deprives me of this potential to have these goods. And hence it helps us to understand and to explain why it is that we view death as bad, even if we don't think that we're actively going to be suffering, that we're not going to actually be experiencing anything after we die. Now, the second argument that he gives in support of this notion of flow as the source of right to life is that he thinks that appealing to flow explains why it is that murder is considered to be such a heinous crime, why it's so morally objectionable, and why it's more morally objectionable than other things like, say, lying or stealing. And he argues that flow explains this by understanding that when you murder someone, you don't just take away some particular bit of value. You don't cause some specific harm, but you in fact cause a deprivation of all possible future values, that you prevent someone from enjoying any values, and so you inflict upon them a much greater, much more serious and widespread harm than any particular act. So if I lie to you, I may inflict a harm on you by depriving you of truthful information. But if I murder you, I deprive you not only of one particular instance where you might benefit from truthful information, but of all instances where you could potentially benefit from truthful information. And so it's like every lie that I could possibly tell you being inflicted on you all at once. And likewise, if I steal money from your wallet, then I'm inflicting a harm on you by depriving you of the value that you might get by being able to spend that money to get things that you want, to get future goods of consciousness. But if I murder you, I deprive you not just of the ability to gain those future goods of consciousness, but the ability to gain all future goods of consciousness, not just your ability to spend this money, but your ability to spend all the money that you have, your ability to spend any money that you make in the future, and so on. And so he suggests that flow helps to explain why it is that murder is so terrible by noting that murder prevents us from all the future goods of consciousness. Hence, murder constitutes a much more serious harm to an individual than any isolated individual action that we might take, like lying or stealing and so on. The third argument that Marquis offers up is arguing that we have these unanimous consensus intuitions or judgments about the moral permissibility or impermissibility of taking lives in various circumstances that we associate, for instance, with serious medical conditions. And so because he thinks flow explains these intuitions, why it is that we have an intuition that is permissible, or why it is that we have an intuition that's impermissible, and why we would differentiate one case from the other, that this supports flow. And so one of the cases that he points to is he says we have this unanimous intuition or judgment that is morally acceptable to kill people who fall into permanent unconsciousness. So people who, say, fall into unrecoverable permanent comas where they're no longer manifesting any symptoms of consciousness, any clear-cut indications that they're experiencing or thinking or feeling and so on. And he thinks that we have this unanimous judgment about these cases that it's morally permissible to kill these people. Now, as we noted earlier when Rachel's was discussing cases like this, it's not obvious that people have this unanimous intuition, and hence it's not obvious that Flo's explaining why it is that the intuition should be this way and not that way is actually something that supports Flo. So people who disagree that it's morally permissible to kill people in irrecoverable comas are going to be moved by this explanation. And similarly, he argues that people who have conditions that result in intractable pain, uncurable diseases that cause people to have such a terrible quality of life that we no longer think that they have something like Flo. He thinks we have judgments that it's morally permissible to kill these people. And again, this is controversial. Remember, we considered a case like this of a man who killed his daughter for exactly these sorts of reasons, and we noted that there were differences amongst people, even people involved in these cases, as to whether or not this was morally permissible. So Flo might provide a means for differentiating cases like this. It might argue for, provide reasons for why we should do this particular action or why it's not morally blameworthy or is morally permissible. But if we don't have unanimity or consensus regarding the course of action that's morally acceptable in these cases, then Flo's clarity might actually count against it. Now, he also points to examples where he thinks have consensus intuitions about it being morally impermissible to kill people. So, for example, if you go to the hospital and you take a sleeping pill and you become unconscious, it's not morally permissible, he says, for us to kill you because you're no longer manifesting the properties that are associated with personhood. And so he says, Flo explains why it is that it's wrong, not because we're depriving you of current goods of consciousness, but because even though you're currently unconscious, we recognize that you have Flo. That is, that you potentially have a future like ours, you potentially have a future that you value where you experience the goods of consciousness, that once the sleeping pill wears off, then all of this potentiality can be actualized, and hence it's wrong to kill you while you're asleep. And then he generalizes this particular argument to the case of abortion. He says fetuses clearly have Flo. As long as they're not aborted, as long as they come to term and are delivered, then they develop into people who experience the goods of consciousness. And so they definitely have Flo. And because they have Flo on this line of argumentation, they have a right to life. We inflict a wrong on them if we act in a way that prevents them from their future life, or their future rather like ours. Now, the final argument that Marquis offers up in support of Flo is an argument that he says helps us to understand why it is that we think it's morally impermissible to cause unnecessary suffering in animals. So he says that animals don't have Flo. They don't have a future like ours. They're not eminently rational. They don't have continuing senses of themselves as entities. They don't communicate complex ideas linguistically, these sorts of things that we associate with human beings. But they do manifest some of the properties that we associate with a future like ours. So animals are capable of having qualitative experiences of pleasure, which are intrinsically rewarding to them and hence intrinsically valuable to them. and they're also capable of experiencing qualitative experiences of pain, which are intrinsically adverse to them. And so they don't manifest flow, sufficient future like ours to have a right to life, but they do manifest aspects of our conception of flow. And those aspects of our conception of flow allow us to reason analogically and to determine that to unnecessarily cause suffering in animals is to inflict a misfortune, to act in a way that causes harm to the animals, and hence act in a way that's morally impermissible.